While my husband was drunk, my stepson and I did something that still leaves me questioning everything. Every time I think about that night, I can't decide if it was a mistake or I keep it as an exciting memory. Let me take you back to where it all started. The evening began like so many others in our household. A quiet hum of normally interrupted only by the occasional clink of a glass or the low hum of the television in the background. My husband John had come home from one of his long trips. Earlier that day, he had barely eaten dinner before pouring himself a drink and settling into his usual corner of the couch. I busied myself in the kitchen, cleaning up the remnants of our meal, my hand scrubbing a plate while my mind wandered elsewhere. John's presence, though familiar, brought little comfort. It wasn't that he was cruel or unkind. He simply wasn't present over time. His absence had become a constant. Even when he was physically in the room, the sound of laughter filtered through the open door. As John chuckled at whatever was on the TV, the sound felt hollow, more like a habit than genuine amusement. I sighed softly, setting the plate down to dry and gazing out the window at the night sky. It was then that I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming down the hallway. I turned to see Hawk, my 18-year-old stepson, standing in the doorway. His hair was slightly tousled, his expression curious but cautious as he glanced between me and the living room. "Hey," he said, his voice low too. Avoid disturbing his father. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I replied, offering a small smile. "Just cleaning up," he nodded, stepping further into the room. "Dad's already had a few, huh?" I gave him a knowing look. "You could say that." Hawk sighed, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. There was something different about him tonight, an intensity in his gaze that made my heart beat a little faster. He had grown so much in the years since I'd first met him, transitioning from an awkward teenager into a confident young man. It was a transformation. I couldn't help but notice, though. I tried not to dwell on it. "Are you staying up late tonight?" he asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," I said, shrugging. "Maybe you should get some rest," he said, his tone thoughtful. "You've been doing everything around here while Dad's been." "Well, you know." I chuckled softly, appreciating his concern. "I'm fine, Hawkie." "Really?" He gave me a look that said he didn't entirely believe me, but chose not to press the issue. Instead, he moved to grab a glass of water, the small kitchen suddenly feeling a bit too small with the two of us in it. John's voice interrupted the quiet moment, slurred and loud from the other room. "Julia, bring me another drink, would you?" Hawk tensed, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the living room. I placed a hand on his arm, a silent reassurance that I had it under control. "I'll take care of it," I said softly. He nodded, his eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. Before he stepped aside to let me pass, I grabbed a fresh glass of Fingit with John's favorite whiskey and carried it to him, setting it on the side table with a practiced smile. "Thanks, sweetheart," he said, already focused back on the screen. I returned to the kitchen, finding Hawkie still there, his posture more relaxed now. "HEK probably fall asleep soon," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Yeah," Hawk said, smirking. "He usually does." We shared a quiet laugh, the tension easing slightly, but as the silence settled again, I felt his gaze on me, steady and unflinching. It wasn't the casual glance of a stepson toward his stepmother. It was something else entirely. My breath caught my pulse quickening as I turned to meet his eyes. "Julia," he began, but whatever he was about to say was interrupted by the sound of John's snores rumbling from the living room. We both froze, listening for a moment to confirm that he was indeed asleep. Hawk exhaled, shaking his head with a small laugh that didn't take long. "No, it didn't," I said, my voice quieter now. The room felt different suddenly. The quiet between us thick with unspoken words. I busied myself with rearranging a dish towel, but I could feel Hawk's presence behind me, solid and steady. "You don't have to do everything alone, you know," he said softly. I turned to face him, my brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean you take care of him of the house of me? But who takes care of you? The question hung in the air, heavy and poignant. Opened my mouth to respond, but found that I didn't have an answer. No one did not really. John's work took him away so often that I'd grown used defending for myself, relying on my own strength to get through the lonely nights. I manage, I said finally, though the words felt. Hollow Hawk stepped closer, his expression. Ernest, you shouldn't have to. You deserve more than that. I looked up at him, startled by the intensity in his voice. There was something in his eyes, a warmth, a determination that made my chest tighten. Hawkeye began, but the words faltered on. My lips. Before I could say anything more, he reached out his hand, brushing against mine. The touch was brief, but electric, sending a jolt of something I couldn't quite name through me. I stepped back instinctively, the distance between us both a relief and a loss. We should get some sleep, I said, my voice shaky. Yeah, he said, though his gaze lingered on me for a moment longer. Good night, Julia. Good night, I replied, watching as he walked down the hallway toward his room. I stood there for a long time. After he'd gone, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. The way he looked at me, the way his touch had lingered. It was too much, and yet not enough. I didn't know what to make of it, but one thing was clear. Something had changed between us and something was about to happen, and I was right about that. Something would happen even quicker than I thought. It started with that. I couldn't sleep that night. The house had grown silent, except for the occasional snore from John in the living room, but my mind was anything but quiet. Hawk's words, his touch, the way he'd looked at me, it all replayed in my head like a loop. I couldn't shut off. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to will the thoughts away, but they refused to budge. And eventually I gave up on sleep altogether and got out of bed, padding quietly down the hallway. The faint glow of the living room lamp spilled into the corridor, but I avoided looking toward John as I passed, not wanting to wake him instead. I headed to the kitchen, thinking a glass of water might help calm my restless mind. As I stood by the sink, sipping from the glass and staring out the window at the dark, quiet street, I heard soft footsteps behind me. My heart skipped, and I turned to see Hawk standing in the doorway. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair still tousled from. Earlier he looked like he'd just woken up, but his eyes were alert, his expression hesitant. I couldn't sleep, he said, his voice low. Me. Neither, I admitted, setting the glass down. He stepped further into the kitchen, leaning against the counter for a moment. Neither of us said anything. The silence between us filled with unspoken tension. I could feel his eyes on me, the weight of his gaze making my chest tighten. Are you okay? He asked softly. I don't know, I replied. Honestly, I guess I just have a lot on my mind. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Me too. I turned to face him, fully leaning back against the counter. What's on your mind? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. You, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The word hung in the air, heavy and charged. My breath caught, and I stared at him, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to brush it off as a moment of confusion or misplaced affection, but another part of me, the part that had been craving connection, intimacy, something more, couldn't ignore the way his words made my heart race. Hawk, I began, but he stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. I mean it, he said, his voice steadier. Now, I've been thinking about you a lot, and I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. You're just confused, I said quickly, though. The words felt hollow, even as I spoke them. We've been spending more time together and with your dad gone. So often it's natural to feel close, it's more than that, he said, shaking his head. I felt this way for a while. Julia. I just didn't know how to say it. His honesty left me speechless. I turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as I tried to steady my thoughts. This was crossing a line we couldn't afford to blur. And yet, I couldn't deny the way his words made me feel wanted, seen alive. You shouldn't feel that way, I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. I can't control how I feel, he said simply, but I can control what I do about it. I turned back to face him, my eyes searching his for any hint of hesitation, but there was none. He looked at me with a steadiness that made my heart ache, as though he was willing me to see him for who he was. Not just as my stepson, but as a man who cared deeply for me. This is complicated, I said, my voice trembling, and your dad is passed out drunk in the living room. He finished his tone, soft but firm. He's not here right now. It's just us. The truth of his words hit me like a punch to the chest. It was just us standing alone in the quiet kitchen. The rest of the world, fading into the background. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of everything on my own. I don't know if I can do this, I said, my voice barely audible. He stepped closer, his hand brushing against mine. I don't want to make things harder for you, he said, but I needed you to know how I feel. His touch was gentle but electric, sending a shiver down my spine. I looked up at him, my heart pounding as the distance between us disappeared. Hawk before I could say anything more. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in the softest, most tentative kiss. My breath hitched, and for a moment, I froze, torn between pulling away and giving in the flood of emotions coursing through me. But then something shifted. I felt my walls crumble, the weight of my loneliness and longing, giving way to something I couldn't ignore. I kissed him back, my hands moving instinctively to his shoulders as I let myself get lost. In the moment, the kiss deepened, and the world around us seemed to fade away. All I could feel was him, his warmth, his presence, the way he made me feel seen and understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we finally pulled away, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. This can't happen, I said, though. My voice lacked conviction. I know, he said, his voice steady, but it already has. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me wanted to push him away, to pretend this had never happened. But another part of me, the part that was tired of being lonely, of feeling invisible, wanted to hold on to him and never let go. The moment lingered heavy and breathless. Hawk stood so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from him, his gaze steady on mine. My heart raced, and my mind screamed at me to step away, to regain some sense of normalcy, but my feet refused to move. Hawk, I began, my voice faltering. We can't. He reached up his fingers, brushing gently against my cheek. I know this is complicated, he said softly, but I've never felt like this before. Not with anyone. His words struck a chord deep within me, one that resonated with my own feelings of isolation and longing. The boundaries we were skirting were clear, but for the first time in years, I felt wanted, truly, undeniably wanted. I stepped back, slightly, trying to put space between us. But Hawk followed his movements, careful and deliberate. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said. If you want me to stop, just say the word. The sincerity in his voice made my chest ache. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he struggled with his own emotions, and it mirrored my own inner turmoil. "This isn't fair," I said, shaking my head. "To you. To me. To your dad. I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't ignore how I feel, and I don't think you can." Either the truth of his words hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. I looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. But all I saw was earnestness and a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "This is so wrong," I murmured, more to myself than to him. And yet he said, stepping closer, "It feels so right." His hand found mine, his fingers threading through mine, in a gesture so simple yet so intimate that it sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I should pull away, that every fiber of my being was telling me to walk out of the room and never look back. But instead, I stayed rooted to the spot, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence. "Hawk," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm scared." "I am too," he admitted. "But I've never been more sure of anything in my life." His words were a catalyst breaking through the walls I'd built around myself before I could think better of it. I leaned forward, my lips brushing against his, in a tentative kiss. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if we were both testing the boundaries of this uncharted territory. But then it deepened, and the world around us seemed to fade into the background. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer. As our kiss grew more fervent, I could feel his heartbeat against mine, a steady rhythm that matched the rapid thrum of my own. My hands found their way to his shoulders, clutching at him, as if he were the only thing keeping me grounded. The faint creak of the floorboards in the living room jolted me back to reality. I pulled away, breathless and wide-eyed, my chest heaving as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. "We can't do this," I said, my voice shaking. "John is just in the other room." Hawk stepped back slightly, his own breathing uneven. "I know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to push you." "It's not just you," I said quickly, my thoughts a whirlwind. "I'm just as much at fault, but it's dangerous." He nodded, his expression conflicted. I understand the tension between us was almost unbearable as we stood there in the dimly lit kitchen, the weight of our actions pressing down on us. I wanted to say something, to find the right words to fix everything, but my mind was blank. The sound of John's snores echoed from the living room, a stark reminder of the reality we were trying to escape. "You should go to bed," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "We'll talk about this in the morning." Hawk hesitated, his eyes searching mine, as if he wanted to say more, but then he nodded, stepping back and heading toward the hallway. "Good night, Julia," he said softly. "Good night," I replied, watching as he disappeared into his room. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time after he'd gone, my thoughts racing. What had started as a quiet evening had turned into something I couldn't have anticipated, something that left me questioning everything. The line we'd crossed couldn't be undone, and the weight of it settled heavily on my shoulders. And the craziest part was that this wasn't over. It was going to repeat itself, but then end in a different way. The next morning, the house was quiet when I woke. John was still passed out on the couch, and Hawk's door was closed. I made my way to the kitchen, the remnants of last night still swirling in my mind as I sipped my coffee. I couldn't help but replay the moment over and over, each detail etched into my memory. The sound of footsteps broke through my thoughts, and I turned to see Hawk entering the kitchen. He looked hesitant, his gaze flickering to mine before dropping to the floor. "Morning," he said, his voice quiet. "Morning," I replied, my heart racing. We stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken tension between us almost palpable. Finally, he looked up, his expression earnest. "About last night, we shouldn't talk about it." I interrupted quickly, my voice firmer than I felt. It was a mistake. It didn't feel like a mistake," he said softly, his eyes holding mine. "Hockey, we can't," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't right. Maybe not," he said, stepping closer, "but it doesn't change how I feel." His words made my chest ache. The raw honesty in his voice cutting through my defenses. I wanted to argue to push him away. But the truth was, I couldn't deny how I felt either. And that was the most terrifying realization. Of all Hawk's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. I clutched my coffee mug as if it could somehow anchor me to reality. But my mind was spiraling. He stood there waiting for a response, his eyes steady on mine. I could see the conflict in his gaze, the hope and fear, tangled together. But I didn't know what to say. "Hawk," I said, finally, my voice trembling. "We need to stop this. We can't let it go any further." His jaw tightened and he nodded, though his expression was far from resigned. "I understand," he said, his tone soft but laced with determination. "But that doesn't mean I can just turn off how I feel." "I know," I replied, my voice barely audible. "But this is dangerous for both of us." He took a step closer, his movements deliberate and slow. "Then tell me you don't feel the same way," he said, his voice steady. "Look me in the eye and tell me that last night didn't mean anything to you." I froze my breath, catching in my throat. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come, because deep down I knew he wasn't the connection. We'd shared the emotions that had surged between us. It had been real. Denying it would be a lie, and we both knew it. "I can't," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But that doesn't make it right?" "Maybe not," he said, stepping closer still. "But it's the truth, and I think that matters." His proximity made my pulse race, and I took a step back, needing to put distance between us. "Your dad is still here," I said, my voice firmer now. "We can't do this. Not with him in the house." Hawk sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're right," he said reluctantly. "But this isn't over, Julia. We can't just pretend it didn't happen." I looked away, unable to face the intensity of his gaze any longer. "We'll talk later," I said, my tone dismissive. "But right now we need to focus on keeping things normal." He nodded, though the tension in his posture made it clear he wasn't happy about it. "Okay," he said quietly. "But I meant what I said. I'm not going to ignore this with that." He turned and left the kitchen, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. I sank into a chair, my hands trembling as I set the mug down, the weight of everything we'd said and done pressed down on me, suffocating in its intensity. But then one evening it seemed to all happen. Once again, the evening was much like the one before. John had poured himself a drink after dinner, and then another and another. By the time the television was on its second rerun of an old sitcom, he was sprawled on the couch, snoring softly, his presence, though technically in the room, was as distant as ever. I moved about the house, tidying up the remnants of dinner and trying to keep my mind occupied. The silence that settled over the house as John drifted into his drunken slumber was almost deafening, amplifying the thoughts I'd tried so hard to bury. Hawk emerged from his room not long after his steps, careful and measured as he entered the kitchen. He glanced at the living room, his lips curving into a small, almost exasperated smile. "Hune's out again? Isn't he like clockwork?" I said, my voice carrying more bitterness than I intended. Hawk leaned against the counter, crossing his arms as he watched me. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. It's nothing I'm not used to," I said, shrugging. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. The weight of loneliness had grown heavier over the years, and the rare moments when it was lifted like last night were impossible to ignore. We stood in silence for a moment, the unspoken tension between us thick and undeniable. I could feel his gaze on me, the intensity of it making my pulse quicken Hawk. "We shouldn't," I began, but my voice faltered as he stepped closer. "I know," he said softly, his eyes searching mine, but I can't help how I feel his honesty left me breathless, and for a moment I forgot how to respond. The boundaries we tried so hard to rebuild seemed fragile, ready to crumble at the slightest touch, and when he reached for me, his fingers brushing against mine, I felt the walls begin to crack. "Hawk," I whispered, but before I could finish, he closed the distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that was both hesitant and filled with longing. I wanted to pull away to stop this, before it went any further, but the pull of his presence was too strong. The warmth of his hands on my back, the way he whispered my name against my lips, it was too much, and I couldn't resist. I let myself get lost in the moment, the world outside fading into a distant memory. We were careful, quiet as we moved from the kitchen to the privacy of my room. The door clicked softly behind us, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of loneliness lift, replaced by something that felt almost like freedom. It was crazy. It was amazing. It felt so wrong, but also so right. I had even forgotten how the energy of such a young man felt. I think we did it like 4, 5, or even 6 times. I lost count. Obviously, the night was full of whispered words and tentative touches each moment, more intense than the last. The connection we tried so hard to deny was undeniable. And for those fleeting hours, nothing else mattered. It was reckless and dangerous. But in the stillness of the room, it felt like the only thing that made sense. As dawn began to break, casting a soft glow through the curtains, we lay side by side, the silence between us filled with unspoken understanding. "We can't keep doing this," I said, finally, my voice barely audible. "I know," he replied, though his tone was tinged with reluctance, "but I don't regret it." Neither did I, though. I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. Instead, I rested my head against his shoulder, letting the warmth of his presence soothe the turmoil in my mind. For now, at least the outside world could wait. Surprisingly, enough the next day passed in a blur of normalcy, though the undercurrent of tension between Hawk and me never truly abated. John eventually roused himself from the couch, groggy and irritable as he nursed his hangover. I played the role of the dutiful wife, making him breakfast and indulging his grumbling, but my mind was elsewhere. Hawky avoided John as much as possible, spending most of the day in his room. I caught glimpses of him now, and then his expression distant and pensive, and each time my chest tightened with a mix of guilt and longing. But then the evening came. After John had gone to bed early, I found myself wandering the house aimlessly. The silence felt oppressive, and my thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and regret. Ended up in the living room, sinking onto the couch and staring blankly at the television. Though I wasn't really watching, the sound of footsteps drew my attention, and I looked up to see Hawk standing in the doorway. He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room, his expression cautious but determined. "Can we talk?" he asked. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He took a seat on the opposite end of the couch, the space between us feeling both too far and too close at the same time. "What's on your mind?" I asked, though. I already knew the answer. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. I don't want things to be weird between us," he said finally, "but I also don't want to pretend like nothing happened." I sighed, leaning back against the couch. "Hawk, I don't know how to fix this. What we did, what we felt. It's not something we can just sweep under the rug, but we can't keep going down this path either. I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice soft but earnest. "You're the one, person who's always been there for me. You're not going to lose me," I said firmly, but we need to set boundaries. This can't happen again." He nodded slowly, though his expression was conflicted. "I'll try," he said, "but it's not going to be easy." "I know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But it's the only way. We sat in silence for a long time, the tension between us heavy but not unbearable. Eventually, Hawk stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "Good night, Julia," he said quietly. "Good night," I replied, watching as he left the room. But there was something in his eyes telling me that this wasn't over, that something was coming. And later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but replay the events of the past 2 days in my mind. The connection between Hawk and me was undeniable, but the consequences of crossing that line were too great to ignore. I told myself we could move past it, that with time the tension would fade, and things would return to normal, but deep down I wasn't so sure. The night stretched on, a heavy stillness settling over the house as I lay in bed, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Sleep was elusive, my thoughts swirling in an endless loop of guilt, longing, and confusion. I told myself that this would pass, that the feelings Hawk and I had acknowledged would fade in time, but the doubt gnawed at me relentlessly. A faint sound broke through the quiet, pulling me from my thoughts. I sat up, listening intently, and heard it again. Soft, hesitant footsteps in the hallway. Chest tightened as the door creaked open slightly, the dim light from the hallway spilling into the room. Julia Hawk's voice was barely above a whisper. I hesitated for a moment before responding, my voice shaky. "What is it, Hawk?" I couldn't sleep," he said, stepping into the room. He looked nervous, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his gaze flickering between me and the floor. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Hawk, you shouldn't be here." "I know," he said quickly, his voice tinged with urgency, "but I needed to talk to you." I glanced toward the closed door, my heart pounding in my chest. John was just down the hall, asleep in the guest room after another evening of overindulging, the risk of being caught scent. A rush of adrenaline through me, but I couldn't bring myself to send Hawk away. "Come in," I said softly, scooting over to make room on the bed. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and sitting down beside me. The mattress dipped under his weight, and the sudden closeness made my pulse quicken. He looked at me, his expression filled with a mix of vulnerability and determination. "I can't stop thinking about what happened," he admitted, his voice barely audible, "about how it felt to be with you." "Hawk," I began, but he cut me off. "I know it's wrong," he said quickly. "I know we can't, but I can't help it. You're all—" I think about his words hit me like a tidal wave, and I struggled to keep my emotions in check. "We can't do this," I said, my voice trembling. "It's too much." "Then why does it feel so right?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "Why does it feel like everything finally makes sense when I'm with you?" I looked away, unable to hold his gaze any longer. "Because we're both lonely," I said finally, and we confusing that loneliness for something. "It's not." "Maybe," he said, leaning closer, "or maybe we're just afraid to admit the truth." The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with tension. I could feel the heat radiating from him, the magnetic pull that I couldn't seem to resist. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, and the contact sent a shiver down my spine. "Hawk, we can't," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Just one last time," he said softly, "and then I'll let it go. I promise." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. Every rational part of me screamed to say no, to stop this before it went any further. But the ache in his voice, the desperation in his eyes mirrored my own, and in that moment I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "Okay," I whispered, the words slipping from my lips before I could stop it. His eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't expected me to agree. But then he leaned in his lips, brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tender and filled with a deep, unspoken longing. I melted into the embrace, my hands tangling in his hair, as the world around us faded away. The kiss deepened, and I felt his arms wrap around me, pulling me closer, as if he couldn't bear the distance between us. It was electric, a surge of emotions and sensations that left me breathless. I clung to him, losing myself in the moment, letting go of everything but the connection we shared. But just as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back in. I pulled away my breathing, ragged, and stared at him with wide eyes. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaking. I know he said his own breathing uneven, but I don't regret it. I looked away, my thoughts a whirlwind. "We have to stop for good this time." He nodded slowly, though. His expression was filled with sadness. I understand the silence between us was heavy, as he stood, his movements reluctant. He paused at the door, glancing back at me one last time. "Good night, Julia," he said softly. "Good night." I replied, my voice barely audible. The days that followed were tense and filled with unspoken emotions. Hawk and I avoided being alone together, and I threw myself into my routine, trying to forget what had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, the memory lingered, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed. John remained oblivious. His time at home filled with his usual habits of drinking and watching television. The distance between us only grew, and I found myself wondering how we'd ended up here, trapped in a marriage that felt more like an obligation than a partnership. Hawk's behavior shifted as well. He seemed more withdrawn, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a quiet seriousness. I wanted to talk to him to find a way to make things right, but I didn't know where to start. One evening as I was cleaning up, after dinner, Hawk approached me in the kitchen. "I think I need to spend some time at my mom's," he said, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. I froze, my heart sinking at his words. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Yeah. I think it's for the best." I wanted to argue, to tell him that he didn't have to go. But I knew he was right. Distance was the only way to move forward, to heal the wounds we'd both inflicted on ourselves and each other. "When are you leaving?" I asked, my chest tight. "Tomorrow." He said, "I already talked to Dad." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," he said softly as he walked away. I felt a pang of regret and longing, but I knew this was the right choice. We had to let each other go, no matter how much it hurt. And as I stood there in the quiet kitchen, I whispered a silent goodbye, hoping that one day we could both find the peace we were searching for. The weeks after all this happened were a real blur of emotions. Hawk and I avoided each other as much as possible, though the tension in the house was palpable. John, oblivious as ever, went about his usual routine, working, drinking, and filling the air with his gruff presence if he noticed anything unusual between us. He didn't say a word. I spent most of my time in the kitchen or tending to chores, trying to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how much I busied myself, the memories of that night lingered, replaying in my head like a vivid dream. The way Hawk had looked at me, the quiet vulnerability in his voice, the undeniable connection we had shared. It all felt so raw, so real. One afternoon as I was folding laundry, Hawk appeared in the doorway. His expression was hesitant, his hands shoved into his pockets. "We need to talk," he said softly. I nodded, setting the laundry aside. I know we sat across from each other at the dining table, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way he struggled to find the right words. "I've been thinking about what happened," he began. "About us, Hawk. We can't." I started, But he shook his head, cutting me off. I know, he said quickly. I know it can't happen again. But I don't regret it. His honesty left me breathless, and I stared at him unsure of how to respond. Hawk, I said, finally my voice trembling. What we did was a mistake. It was reckless, and it's not something we can build a future on. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I get it, he said, quietly. But that doesn't mean I can just pretend it didn't happen. We have to, I said firmly. For your sake, for mine and for John. What we did? It's not who we are. He nodded slowly, though his expression remained conflicted. I just don't know how to move on from this. He admitted, I don't know how to look at you and not feel. You will, I said, my voice softening. It'll take time, but you will, and so will I. The silence between us was heavy, but there was a mutual understanding in it, a recognition that this was the only way forward. Eventually, Hawk stood, his movements slow and deliberate. I think I need some space, he said. Maybe it's time I stayed with Mom for a while. His words hit me like a punch to the chest, but I nodded knowing he was right. If that's what you need, I said, my voice steady, despite the ache in my heart. I'll call Dad tonight. He said, let him know. I'll be leaving in the morning the next day. Hawk packed his bags, his presence in the house replaced by an emptiness that felt almost unbearable. John barely seemed to notice, dismissing it with a gruff kids need their space before returning to his drink. As I watched Hawk's car pull out of the driveway, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. We had done the right thing, putting distance between us, allowing time to heal the wounds we had inflicted on ourselves and each other. But the pain of letting go was sharper than I had expected, a reminder of just how deeply we had crossed the line in the weeks that followed. I focused on rebuilding my life, trying to mend the cracks in my marriage, and find a sense of normalcy again. Hawk and I exchanged polite texts, now and then updates about schoolwork and life in general, but the intimacy we had shared was gone, replaced by a respectful distance. I told myself it was for the best, that this was the only way forward. And slowly, the weight of that night began to lift. Though it never disappeared completely, it lingered in the quiet moments. A reminder of the choices we had made and the boundaries we had crossed. But life went on as it always does, and though the scars of that night remained, they became a part of my story, a testament to the mistakes I had made and the strength it took to move on. As I already mentioned, I still don't know what to think of this. Have you ever faced a decision where your heart and your mind were at war? Let me know your thoughts. Your perspective might help me find clarity. Thank you.